Money as Perception. Introduction. This audiobook is not about getting rich quickly. It does not offer shortcuts, promises, or financial formulas. What it offers is something more fundamental. It is an examination of how money is experienced, why certain financial patterns repeat over and over again, and why effort alone often fails to produce lasting stability. Most people assume money problems are external. They blame circumstances, timing, the economy, or lack of opportunity. But experience shows something curious. Two people can live in the same environment, face similar conditions, and yet experience money in completely different ways. One struggles constantly. The other stabilizes over time. The difference is not luck. It is perception. To explore this, we turn to ideas inspired by the work of Jacobo Grinberg, a Mexican neuroscientist and psychologist whose research focused on perception, consciousness, and the way reality is constructed in human experience. Grinberg was born in Mexico City in 1946. He studied psychology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and later conducted research in neurophysiology and psychophysiology. During the 1970s and 1980s, his work explored how the brain organizes experience and how consciousness interacts with what he described as an informational field. He called this theoretical model syntaggy, a way of understanding how perception, expectation, and internal coherence shape what feels solid, real, and repeatable in a person's life. Grinberg's work was unconventional, but it was not religious, mystical, or motivational in the popular sense. He did not teach manifestation techniques. He did not promise wealth, success, or transformation. His focus was more precise and in many ways more unsettling. He asked a simple but profound question. Why does reality feel stable for some people and unstable for others? According to Grinberg, reality is not experienced directly. It is organized. What we call reality is the result of how perception, attention, emotion, and expectation interact over time. When those elements are coherent, experience stabilizes. When they are fragmented, experience becomes repetitive and unstable. This idea has powerful implications. From this perspective, money is not a magical object, a reward from the universe, or an external force that arrives or disappears at random. It is a human experience shaped by attention, interpretation, emotional response, and habitual behavior. Money behaves the way it does in your life because your perception has been organized in a certain way for a long time. If money feels unstable, stressful, or unpredictable, the explanation is not necessarily a lack of intelligence, discipline, or effort. More often, it is the result of internal structures that were formed unconsciously and reinforced through repetition. These structures are not permanent, but they are persistent. Jacobo Grinberg disappeared in 1994 under circumstances that remain unexplained, and much speculation has surrounded his legacy. In this audiobook, we set all of that aside. We are not interested in myths or theories about his disappearance. We are interested only in the ideas he left behind, ideas about perception, coherence, and the construction of experience, and how those ideas can help explain why financial patterns tend to repeat even when people try hard to change them. This audiobook explores 7 laws related to perception and internal coherence, inspired by Grinberg's theoretical framework. These principles do not promise wealth. They explain something more valuable: why certain outcomes keep happening, and what changes when perception becomes clearer and more stable. Nothing here replaces action. Nothing here denies responsibility. What this work offers is understanding, and when understanding reaches a certain depth, behavior changes quietly. Decisions become clearer, reactions soften, patterns begin to shift. Not suddenly, not magically, but steadily. If you continue listening, you are not agreeing to believe anything. You are simply allowing yourself to observe how perception operates. And that observation, when sustained, changes more than people expect. Law 1. Language as an organizer of perception. When people hear that language affects money, they often dismiss the idea as superstition or positive thinking. That reaction is understandable. Language does not create money, and words alone do not change economic reality. However, language does something more subtle and more powerful. It organizes perception. Jacobo Grinberg emphasized that human beings do not experience reality directly. The brain does not function like a camera recording the world as it is. Instead, it selects, interprets, and structures information in order to produce a coherent experience. Language plays an important role in that process. Every word you use repeatedly becomes a mental reference point. Over time, these reference points shape what your mind treats as normal, expected, or unavoidable. Consider how often people describe money using the same expressions. It never lasts. It always disappears. I'm terrible with finances. Money is stressful. These statements are not predictions, and they are not confessions. They are descriptions repeated so often that they become assumptions. Assumptions quietly guide perception. When a person assumes money is unstable, their attention becomes biased toward instability. They notice losses more than gains. They anticipate problems before they occur. They become cautious in situations that might actually require clarity and initiative. This is not a moral issue. It is a cognitive one. Grinberg's work suggests that perception is shaped by coherence. When thoughts, emotions, and language point in the same direction, perception stabilizes around that direction. If someone consistently speaks about money as a source of anxiety, their emotional response aligns with that message and their behavior follows. The result is not punishment. The result is reinforcement. Over time, language stops feeling like description and starts functioning like a rule. This is why. Simply thinking positively does not work. Replacing negative statements with exaggerated affirmations often creates internal conflict. The mind detects inconsistency, and perception becomes unstable rather than clearer. The purpose of this principle is not to force optimism. It is to reduce distortion. Neutral language creates a clearer perception. For example, there is a difference between saying, "I never have enough money," and saying, "I need to organize this situation better." The second statement does not deny reality. It does not promise abundance. It simply removes unnecessary emotional charge and opens space for problem solving. Grinberg's framework helps explain why this matters. If reality is experienced through interpretation, then an emotionally loaded interpretation narrows the range of perceived options. An interpretation that is calmer and more precise expands it. This does not guarantee better outcomes. It increases the likelihood of better decisions. Many people unknowingly reinforce financial stress by narrating it constantly. They repeat the same phrases internally and externally, which keeps the mind focused on survival rather than structure. Language trains attention. If attention is always directed toward lack, perception becomes selective. Opportunities may exist, but they are not registered as relevant or realistic. This is not because opportunities are absent, but because perception is organized around threat management. Changing language is therefore not about attracting money. It is about interrupting automatic framing. One practical way to apply this principle is to observe how you speak about money for a short period of time without trying to correct it. Simply notice patterns, notice repetition, notice emotional tone. Then, instead of replacing language with exaggerated positivity, aim for precision. Replace statements that are absolute with statements that are specific. Replace emotionally charged phrases with descriptive ones. For example, instead of "money always goes wrong," say, "this situation needs review." Instead of "I'm bad with money," say, "I haven't developed a system yet." Instead of, "This is impossible," say, "I don't see the solution yet." These shifts may seem small, but they matter because they change what the mind prepares for. Grinberg's work does not suggest that words command reality. It suggests that repeated meaning organizes experience. When language becomes less distorted, perception becomes more flexible. When perception becomes more flexible, behavior tends to follow. And when behavior changes, outcomes sometimes change as well. This is not immediate, it is gradual, and that is precisely why it works. Financial stability rarely appears suddenly. It emerges from repeated decisions made with clarity rather than fear. Language supports or disrupts that clarity. This principle is not about control, it is about awareness. Once you recognize how language conditions perception, you stop using words carelessly, not because you are afraid of them, but because you understand their function. They are not spells, they are signals. Signals that tell your mind what kind of reality to prepare for. Language shapes perception, but it is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies a deeper pattern, how people relate to movement, security, and control when it comes to money. In the next section, we examine why fear of loss often creates stagnation and why psychological contraction tends to produce financial instability over time. Law 2. Flow and psychological contraction. Many people believe that financial stability comes from holding on as tightly as possible. Saving more, spending less, avoiding risk, and staying in control are often presented as the safest strategies. On the surface, these ideas sound reasonable, and in certain situations they are necessary. But when they are driven by fear rather than clarity, they tend to produce the opposite of what is intended. Jacobo Grinberg's work helps explain why. He described consciousness as something that organizes experience through patterns of coherence. When those patterns become rigid, experience narrows. When they remain flexible, experience expands. This applies not only to perception but also to behavior. Money, as a social and practical tool, depends on movement. It circulates through exchange, decision, and interaction. When a person's relationship with money becomes dominated by fear of loss, that movement slows or becomes distorted. The issue is not spending or saving in themselves. The issue is psychological contraction. Psychological contraction occurs when attention is dominated by threat. In this state, the mind focuses on preservation rather than structure. Decisions are made to avoid discomfort rather than to improve conditions. Over time, this creates instability rather than safety. A person in contraction becomes hyper-aware of what could go wrong. They delay decisions, hesitate to invest in tools or learning, and avoid opportunities that require commitment. Even when money is available, it feels unsafe to use it. As a result, resources remain idle or are used defensively rather than productively. Grinberg would not describe this as bad behavior or poor character. He would describe it as a perceptual state. In a contracted state, the field of experience becomes smaller. Fewer possibilities are considered viable. Fewer actions feel reasonable. This is why extreme frugality driven by fear often leads to stagnation. The person believes they are protecting themselves, but they are actually reinforcing a perception of threat. That perception becomes the organizing principle of their financial life. Flow, in this context, does not mean recklessness. It does not mean spending without thought or ignoring consequences. It means allowing money to move in alignment with a clear purpose rather than fear. When money flows with intention, it supports function. It pays for tools that improve efficiency. It supports learning that increases competence. It enables systems that reduce long-term stress. This type of movement stabilizes experience rather than destabilizing it. The difference between healthy flow and harmful loss lies in psychological orientation, not in the act of spending itself. Consider two people who spend the same amount of money. One does it from anxiety, worrying about what might happen, and resenting the expense. The other does it from clarity, understanding why the expense exists and what it supports. Externally, the action looks the same. Internally, the experience is completely different. According to Grinberg's framework, the internal state matters because it affects coherence. Anxiety fragments attention, clarity aligns it. Fragmented attention leads to scattered action. Aligned attention leads to more effective action. Over time, these differences compound. People who remain in contraction often experience recurring financial emergencies, not because emergencies are inevitable, but because their attention is focused on short-term avoidance rather than long-term structure. Preventive decisions are postponed. Systems are neglected. Small issues become large problems. Flow supports prevention, contraction supports reaction. This is why many people feel trapped in cycles of financial stress even when they work hard. Their effort is real, but their perception remains defensive. As a result, effort is spent maintaining survival rather than improving stability. Grinberg's ideas suggest that expanding perception begins with reducing unnecessary fear. When fear subsides, the mind can evaluate situations more accurately. It can distinguish between actual risk and imagined threat. This shift does not happen by forcing optimism. It happens by observing fear without letting it dictate every decision. One practical application of this law is to notice how you feel when money leaves your possession. If every expense produces tension, resentment, or panic, that response deserves attention. Not because spending is wrong, but because fear is organizing perception. Another application is to examine areas where avoiding discomfort has created larger problems: delayed maintenance, postponed education, and neglected. Planning often costs more in the long run than addressing them early. These patterns usually originate from contraction. Flow is restored gradually. It begins when money is treated as a functional resource rather than a source of identity or security. When money is used deliberately with awareness rather than fear, perception stabilizes. This does not eliminate uncertainty. It reduces distortion. In Grinberg's terms, coherence increases when internal responses align with external reality. Money moves, circumstances change, attempts to freeze reality through control create friction. Allowing appropriate movement reduces it. Financial stability is not achieved by eliminating movement. It is achieved by directing movement intelligently. Language shapes perception, and contraction limits it. But even when perception becomes clearer, another factor remains: identity. In the next section, we explore why outcomes rarely change unless a person's sense of self changes, and why effort alone cannot override a deeply rooted identity. Law 3, identity precedes outcome. Most people believe that financial change begins with effort. Work harder, learn more, push further, and results will eventually follow. Effort is important, but effort alone does not explain why some patterns repeat, regardless of how much energy is applied. Jacobo Grinberg's work points to a deeper factor: identity. Identity is not a label or a self-description. It is a set of expectations the mind holds about what is normal, possible, and sustainable. These expectations operate quietly, shaping decisions long before conscious choice appears. From this perspective, outcomes do not arise from desire. They arise from coherence between identity and behavior. A person can want financial stability while unconsciously identifying with instability. In that case, effort often increases stress rather than progress. The person works harder, but their decisions still reflect the same underlying assumptions. Grinberg did not describe this as self-sabotage. He described it as structural consistency. Systems tend to reproduce what they recognize as familiar. If a person's internal sense of normal includes urgency, uncertainty, or lack, their behavior will unconsciously maintain those conditions. Even positive changes may feel uncomfortable or temporary, leading to a return to familiar patterns. This explains why sudden financial improvements often fail to last. When income increases but identity remains unchanged, perception treats the new situation as unstable. The person becomes anxious, overreactive, or careless. Eventually, conditions return to what feels normal. Identity operates as a stabilizing force, not a moral one. This is why visualization or affirmations alone are insufficient. Imagining a different future does not alter the expectations that govern behavior. Acting differently for short periods does not reconfigure identity. Identity changes through repeated experience of coherence. Grinberg's framework suggests that reality responds to structure, not wishes. Structure is formed when thoughts, emotions, and actions consistently align with a new expectation. This does not require pretending to be someone else. It requires observing the assumptions that currently shape behavior. For example, a person who identifies as someone who struggles with money may consistently delay decisions, avoid financial planning, or react emotionally to expenses. These behaviors are not chosen consciously. They arise naturally from the identity. To change outcomes, the identity must become more precise and functional. That begins with small but consistent shifts in behavior that align with stability rather than urgency. Identity is reinforced through action. When someone begins to act as a person who organizes, reviews, and plans, their sense of self gradually adjusts. Over time, what once felt forced begins to feel normal. This process is slow by design. Rapid change often triggers resistance because it conflicts with established identity. Gradual change allows perception to adapt without instability. Grinberg emphasized that coherence is key. When actions match internal expectations, experience stabilizes. When they conflict, stress increases. This is why sustainable financial change feels calm rather than dramatic. Another important aspect of identity is tolerance. People unconsciously limit how much stability or success they believe they can handle. When conditions exceed that tolerance, behavior changes to restore balance. This is not fear of success, it is unfamiliarity. If stability has never been experienced consistently, it may feel unreliable or undeserved. The mind seeks what it recognizes, even if what it recognizes is uncomfortable. Changing identity requires exposure. This does not mean overspending or forcing lifestyle changes. It means allowing the mind to experience order without anxiety. Simple practices support this shift. Reviewing finances regularly rather than avoiding them. Making decisions based on information rather than emotion. Completing small commitments reliably. Each of these actions sends a signal to perception that stability is manageable. Over time, identity adjusts. In Grinberg's terms, the field reorganizes when internal structure changes. This reorganization does not guarantee specific outcomes, but it changes what outcomes are likely. When identity aligns with clarity rather than chaos, behavior becomes more consistent. When behavior becomes consistent, external conditions often stabilize. This is not a promise, it is a pattern. Financial outcomes follow identity, not because identity attracts money, but because identity governs behavior, and behavior governs results. Language organizes perception, flow supports movement, identity stabilizes patterns. But there is another factor that quietly reinforces outcomes over time. Coherence between what you feel toward money and what you see in others. In the next section, we examine how judgment, resentment, and comparison affect perception and why these internal responses often shape long-term financial experience. Law 4. Coherence and feedback. Many people believe their financial situation is shaped primarily by external forces, the economy, opportunities, employers, or chance. While external conditions matter, they do not fully explain why similar situations produce very different long-term results for different people. Jacobo Grinberg approached this question from the idea of feedback. In his framework, reality responds not to isolated actions, but to patterns of coherence. What a person repeatedly emits through thought, emotion, and interpretation tends to return, not as punishment or reward, but as reinforcement. This is often confused with the idea of karma, but in Grinberg's work, this process is not moral and it is not spiritual in a religious sense. It is functional. Systems tend to reflect their own structure. In financial life, this feedback loop operates quietly. It is rarely created by visible actions alone. More often, it is created by internal responses that repeat automatically over time. Consider how people react emotionally to money they do not have, money they must spend, or money others possess. These reactions form a consistent pattern of interpretation. That pattern shapes attention, expectation, and behavior. When someone feels resentment toward those who have more, their perception subtly associates wealth with threat, unfairness, or corruption. That association does not affect other people's wealth. It affects the person's own tolerance for financial growth. When someone feels guilt or discomfort about receiving money, their perception treats income as unstable or undeserved. That discomfort influences decisions, often leading to avoidance or self-limitation. Grinberg would describe this as a coherence issue. The internal response and the desired outcome are misaligned. The system responds by restoring internal consistency, even if that consistency produces unwanted results. Feedback works through repetition. A single reaction does not determine anything, but repeated emotional responses become part of the structure that organizes experience. This explains why financial patterns often persist across years. The external situation may change, but the internal response remains the same. As a result, behavior adapts to recreate familiar conditions. This is not fate, it is conditioning. Grinberg emphasized that the field responds to information, not intention. Information includes emotional tone, interpretation, and expectation. When these elements are consistent, the system stabilizes around them. Judgment plays a significant role here. Judgment is not limited to criticizing others. It includes subtle, internal commentary about money itself. Statements such as "people with money are selfish" or "money changes people for the worse" do not remain abstract opinions. They become organizing principles. The mind learns that wealth is something to avoid rather than integrate. Even self-judgment contributes to this feedback loop. Regret, shame, and persistent self-criticism related to past financial decisions reinforce an identity of error and instability. That identity shapes future behavior. Feedback does not mean that mistakes permanently damage outcomes. It means that unresolved emotional responses keep reactivating the same patterns. Grinberg's framework suggests that feedback can be altered by changing the information entering the system. This does not require denial or forced positivity. It requires awareness and adjustment. One way to adjust feedback is to observe reactions without reinforcing them. When noticing resentment, comparison, or guilt, the goal is not to suppress the emotion, but to prevent it from becoming a defining interpretation. Another way is to deliberately introduce coherence. This means aligning internal responses with the type of experience one wishes to sustain. For example, when encountering financial success in others, acknowledging it without comparison reduces internal conflict. It signals that prosperity is not inherently threatening. This does not produce wealth directly. It increases tolerance for it. When paying expenses, approaching the act with clarity rather than resentment reduces emotional fragmentation. The expense remains real, but the experience becomes more neutral. Neutrality supports better decision-making. Grinberg would argue that when emotional charge decreases, perception becomes clearer. Clear perception allows for better feedback. Over time, feedback reorganizes behavior. This process is gradual. Feedback loops do not collapse instantly. They weaken as new patterns repeat consistently. The purpose of this law is not to assign blame. It is to explain why financial outcomes often feel personal, even when they are not intentional. Internal responses are personal. Their repetition creates familiarity. When coherence improves, feedback changes. When feedback changes, experience reorganizes. This does not guarantee success. It reduces self-generated resistance. Financial stability emerges more easily when internal reactions no longer contradict the direction one is trying to move. Perception is shaped by language. Flow is affected by contraction. Identity stabilizes behavior. Feedback reinforces patterns. There is one more factor that often keeps these patterns in place: resistance. In the next section, we examine why fighting financial problems often strengthens them and how reducing resistance changes what becomes possible. Law 5. Non-resistance and perceptual clarity. When people encounter financial difficulty, their first instinct is often to fight it. They worry, rehearse worst-case scenarios, replay mistakes, and mentally argue with the situation. This response feels natural, even responsible. After all, money problems have real consequences. However, from the perspective of perception and consciousness, this reaction often makes the situation more rigid rather than more solvable. Jacobo Grinberg's work suggests that resistance fixes perception. When perception becomes fixed, experience tends to repeat itself. This does not happen because resistance is morally wrong, but because it narrows attention and reduces flexibility. Resistance in this sense does not mean taking action. It means adding emotional struggle to a situation that already exists. The struggle consumes attention and energy without improving clarity. When someone resists a financial problem internally, their mind becomes occupied with tension. Thoughts revolve around fear, blame, urgency, or regret. In this state, perception focuses on the problem itself rather than on potential responses. This is why people often say they feel stuck during financial stress. They are active mentally, but not effectively. Their attention is locked onto what they want to avoid rather than what they need to understand. Grinberg would describe this as a coherence issue. The internal state is organized around threat rather than resolution. When that happens, the field of experience offers fewer options, not because solutions do not exist, but because perception is too narrow to register them. Non-resistance does not mean passivity. It does not mean ignoring bills, avoiding responsibility, or waiting for problems to disappear. It means removing unnecessary internal friction so that perception can widen. When emotional resistance decreases, the mind regains access to information. It can evaluate the situation more objectively. It can distinguish between what can be changed immediately and what cannot. This shift often feels counterintuitive. People fear that if they stop worrying, they will stop caring. In reality, worry rarely improves outcomes. It only increases pressure. Non-resistance creates space. In that space, action becomes more deliberate rather than reactive. Consider two people facing the same financial challenge. One reacts with panic, constantly thinking about consequences, replaying scenarios, and criticizing oneself. The other acknowledges the difficulty but does not add emotional struggle. They assess facts, explore options, and take steps calmly. The difference is not motivation. It is perceptual clarity. Grinberg's framework suggests that when the mind is overloaded with resistance, it cannot reorganize information efficiently. When resistance eases, perception becomes more fluid. This fluidity does not eliminate problems. It improves response. Non-resistance also affects time perception. Under stress, everything feels urgent. Decisions are rushed or avoided entirely. When resistance decreases, time feels more available. This allows for planning rather than improvisation. Another effect of resistance is fixation on control. Financial stress often leads people to attempt to control every detail. This creates rigidity. Rigid systems break more easily under pressure. Non-resistance allows for adaptation. It recognizes that not all variables can be controlled, but many can be managed intelligently. Grinberg emphasized that consciousness organizes reality through interaction. Interaction requires responsiveness. Responsiveness is lost when perception is dominated by struggle. One practical way to apply this law is to observe emotional reactions when thinking about financial problems. Notice whether the reaction adds information or simply adds tension. If it adds only tension, it is resistance. Reducing resistance does not require suppressing emotion. It requires acknowledging emotion without letting it dictate interpretation. This allows perception to remain open. Another application is to separate action from emotion. Necessary actions can be taken without emotional escalation. Paying a bill, negotiating a payment, or seeking advice does not require panic. Over time, non-resistance changes experience. Problems still occur, but they do not accumulate unnecessary weight. This reduces burnout and increases consistency. In Grinberg's terms, reducing resistance improves coherence between internal state and external reality. When coherence increases, the system reorganizes more efficiently. This law does not promise an immediate resolution. It offers better access to solutions. Financial difficulties are often complex. They require clarity, patience, and repeated adjustment. Resistance interferes with all three. By removing internal struggle, you do not weaken your position. You strengthen it. Non-resistance restores clarity, but clarity alone is not always enough. There is another factor that strongly influences long-term patterns: emotional resolution. In the next section, we explore how unresolved emotions related to money, such as resentment, guilt, and regret, affect perception, and why resolving them increases coherence. Law 6. Emotional resolution and coherence. Even when language becomes clearer, flow improves, identity stabilizes, and resistance decreases, many financial patterns continue for one simple reason: unresolved emotion. People often underestimate the role emotions play in shaping long-term experience. They assume emotions are temporary reactions that pass on their own. In reality, emotions that are not processed tend to settle into the background and become part of perception. Jacobo Grinberg viewed emotion as information, not something separate from cognition, but something that actively participates in how reality is structured. When emotional information remains unresolved, it continues to influence perception even when a person believes they have moved on. This is especially true with money. Money is rarely just money. It is tied to early experiences, family dynamics, success, failure, responsibility, and self-worth. As a result, emotional reactions around money often originate long before adulthood. Unresolved resentment toward parents for financial instability, anger toward institutions, shame over past mistakes, or guilt about earning more than others can remain active for years. These emotions do not need to be consciously recalled to influence behavior. They operate quietly, shaping expectations and reactions. From Grinberg's perspective, this creates incoherence. The conscious desire for stability conflicts with unresolved emotional information that signals danger, injustice, or unworthiness. The system responds by maintaining internal consistency rather than external change. This is not punishment, it is a regulation. Emotional resolution restores coherence. When emotional signals are processed and integrated, perception becomes less distorted. The mind no longer needs to defend against internal conflict. Forgiveness is often misunderstood in this context. It is not a moral act, and it is not an excuse for others' behavior. It is a practical process of releasing emotional charge that no longer serves a functional purpose. Grinberg's framework suggests that when emotional charge decreases, the informational field reorganizes. This does not mean circumstances magically change. It means the individual interacts with circumstances differently. A person who resolves resentment toward money no longer approaches financial decisions with defensiveness. A person who releases shame is less likely to avoid planning or seeking information. A person who resolves guilt is more comfortable receiving and sustaining improvement. Emotional resolution increases tolerance. Many people unconsciously limit improvement because they are emotionally prepared only for instability. Stability feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar experiences trigger discomfort. Emotional resolution expands what feels manageable. This is why emotional work often precedes behavioral change. Without it, new behaviors feel forced and eventually collapse. One practical way to begin emotional resolution is to observe recurring emotional reactions related to money. Notice situations that consistently trigger anger, anxiety, or withdrawal. These reactions often point to unresolved information. Another approach is to examine narratives from the past. Family stories about money, early experiences of loss or pressure, and formative failures all leave emotional traces. These traces do not disappear through reasoning alone. Resolution does not require reliving the past in detail. It requires acknowledging the emotional residue and allowing it to be processed without judgment. This may involve recognizing that certain beliefs were adopted during times of limited understanding. It may involve accepting mistakes without attaching identity to them. It may involve letting go of comparisons that no longer reflect current reality. Grinberg emphasized that coherence increases when internal contradictions decrease. Emotional resolution reduces contradiction. As coherence increases, perception becomes more stable. When perception stabilizes, behavior becomes more consistent. When behavior is consistent, long-term outcomes are more predictable. This process is gradual. Emotional patterns formed over the years do not dissolve instantly, but even partial resolution can produce noticeable changes in clarity and decision-making. It is important to note that emotional resolution does not eliminate all negative emotion. Stress, frustration, and disappointment are part of life. Resolution means these emotions no longer dominate interpretation. When emotions are integrated rather than suppressed, they stop distorting perception. Financial stability often improves not because circumstances change dramatically, but because reactions become proportionate. Proportionate reactions support rational planning and steady progress. In Grinberg's terms, emotional resolution allows the field to operate with less noise. Less noise means a clearer signal. A clearer signal supports better interaction with reality. This is not therapy, it is maintenance. Just as systems require regular adjustment, emotional information requires processing to prevent accumulation. Clarity of language, healthy flow, stable identity, coherent feedback, non-resistance, and emotional resolution all contribute to one final factor. That factor determines whether these changes can be sustained. In the final section, we examine certainty, not as belief or hope, but as internal stability that allows coherence to persist over time. Law 7. Internal certainty and stability. By the time people reach this point, they often expect a final technique or a decisive action that will lock in change. In reality, what determines whether change lasts is not a technique at all. It is internal stability. Jacobo Grinberg's work suggests that experience becomes stable when the internal system organizing perception remains coherent over time. Without that coherence, even well-designed actions collapse under pressure. Internal certainty is not belief, optimism, or confidence in a specific outcome. It is the absence of internal contradiction when facing uncertainty. A person with internal certainty can acknowledge risk without panic and continue acting with clarity even when results are delayed. Most people rely on external confirmation to feel stable. When money improves, they feel calm. When it worsens, anxiety returns. This creates a reactive cycle where behavior is constantly adjusted based on short-term outcomes. Over time, this prevents the formation of long-term structure. Grinberg would argue that systems organized around external feedback remain unstable by definition. External conditions fluctuate. When internal organization depends on those fluctuations, coherence cannot be sustained. Internal certainty functions as a stable reference point. It allows perception and behavior to remain aligned regardless of temporary changes. This does not eliminate uncertainty. It prevents uncertainty from reorganizing identity. One way to understand this is through time perspective. People without internal certainty focus heavily on immediate results. When progress slows, they assume failure. When results improve, they assume permanence. Both interpretations are distortions. Internal certainty introduces a longer time horizon. It recognizes that improvement unfolds unevenly. This perspective reduces emotional volatility and supports consistent behavior. Consistency is critical. Financial stability is not created by isolated decisions, but by patterns of behavior maintained over time. Without internal certainty, these patterns break down under stress. Another characteristic of internal certainty is reduced urgency. Urgency often appears productive, but it usually signals fear. Decisions made under urgency tend to prioritize immediate relief over structural improvement. When internal certainty increases, urgency decreases. Decisions are still made, but they are made with consideration rather than pressure. This leads to better planning and fewer reactive mistakes. Grinberg emphasized that coherence emerges when internal signals align. When thoughts, emotions, and actions point in the same direction, perception stabilizes. Internal certainty reflects that alignment. It also reduces the need for reassurance. People with internal certainty do not require constant confirmation that they are on the right track. They evaluate progress based on structure rather than emotion. This does not mean ignoring feedback. It means interpreting feedback without destabilization. Setbacks are seen as information rather than threats. Another important function of internal certainty is error tolerance. People without it interpret mistakes as evidence of failure. This leads to discouragement or avoidance. People with internal certainty interpret mistakes as part of the process. They adjust without abandoning direction. This distinction is crucial. Financial systems improve through iteration. Without tolerance for error, iteration stops. Internal certainty is built through repetition. It develops as people observe that consistent behavior produces gradual improvement, even when results are uneven. Over time, this observation becomes internalized. This is why shortcuts fail. Sudden changes do not allow perception to adapt. Without adaptation, identity resists. Without an identity shift, behavior reverts. Internal certainty requires experience of coherence. That experience cannot be rushed. Grinberg's work suggests that when internal organization stabilizes, external experience becomes more predictable. Predictable does not mean easy, it means less chaotic. Financial stability often appears boring from the outside. It lacks drama. It involves routine, review, and adjustment. Internal certainty allows people to tolerate this lack of excitement without sabotaging progress. Another effect of internal certainty is reduced comparison. When behavior is guided by internal standards, other people's outcomes lose their power. To destabilize perception, comparison shifts from emotional to informational. This does not eliminate ambition, it refines it. Internal certainty also supports patience. Patience is not waiting without action, it is acting without anxiety. Anxiety disrupts perception, patience preserves it. In Grinberg's terms, internal certainty allows the field to remain organized even when information changes. This organization is what sustains progress. Without it, every setback feels personal. With it, setbacks are contextual. This law does not promise success, it explains sustainability. When internal certainty is present, perception remains clear under pressure. Behavior remains aligned despite fluctuations. Identity remains stable even as circumstances evolve. This is the foundation that allows all previous laws to function together. Without internal certainty, coherence breaks. With it, coherence endures. That endurance is what ultimately shapes long-term experience. Bringing the 7 laws together. This audiobook did not present techniques or promises. It presented a framework for understanding why certain financial experiences repeat and how they begin to change. Language organizes perception. Flow supports movement. Identity stabilizes behavior. Feedback reinforces patterns. Non-resistance restores clarity. Emotional resolution reduces distortion. Internal certainty sustains coherence. None of these operates in isolation. Together, they describe how experience is structured over time. Jacobo Grinberg did not offer financial advice. He offered insight into how consciousness interacts with reality. Applied carefully, that insight helps explain why stability is not achieved through force or desire, but through alignment and consistency. Money is not the goal. Stability is not an event. They are outcomes of coherent interaction with reality. When perception changes, behavior follows. When behavior changes, outcomes often change. When internal structure stabilizes, external experience tends to stabilize as well. This is not instant. It is cumulative, and that is precisely why it lasts.